Australia is the greatest nation on earth, and at the referendum last year, Australians told the elites they want to keep it that way. Is 2024 the year mainstream Australians continue to secure our way of life, or will the elites strike back? In Season 3 of Australia's Future, former Prime Minister Tony Abbott will share his unique insight on the future of the Australian way of life. Well, hello Tony, and g'day to all of our listeners. Great to be back for another episode. Today, Tony and I will be discussing the 2024 federal budget and the UN vote for Palestine that took place recently. Tony, great to be back with you.
Dan, good to be with you too, and I wish these were better times, but we have to deal with the situation we find ourselves in.
We certainly do, Tony. And look, we're going to have to start on a depressing note, which is the federal budget. We were just discussing off air that it was lackluster, to say the least. Look, we'll get into the details of it, Tony, but just to start with, your headline assessment of the budget and what it means for Australia.
I thought the budget needed to do three things. In the short term, it needed to rein in inflationary pressures. In the medium term, it needed to get government spending back under better control. And in the longer term, it needed to strengthen our economy's productivity and resilience. And unfortunately, it did none of these things. And to that extent, it badly lets our country down. Because as we know, we face a more perilous world than at any time in many, many decades. And in the end, we can only flourish in a more difficult world if our economy is strong, if our society is strong, if our culture is cohesive. And I guess the budget, far from helping, is going to do us damage. So that's my despondency about last night's budget, and it's my, despondency about a great country which is drifting backwards.
Well, the thing that really struck me about the budget was a complete and total lack of vision or ambition for the nation and our future. I think it says everything about our political class that the entire debate about our nation's future is about whether a $300 subsidy should be means tested or not. It's completely missing the big challenges that you've alluded to. Take us back to your government's first budget, which was the last time a genuine effort was made at some of those structural reforms. You brought in spending restraint. You started to get the debt under control. There was the beginning of the productivity agenda and the tax agenda that needed to happen. Almost a decade on, and things have gotten much worse. So talk about that, your budget and what you were trying to achieve.
Well, Dan, there were two fundamental insights which informed the 2014 Abbott hockey budget. The first is that government, like businesses and households, has got to live within its means. And the second is that government cannot spend $1 that it does not, in the end, take off us, the taxpayer. And that means that government should only spend money on those things which are absolutely necessary. It should only spend money on those things which government has to do that people can't do for themselves. And so to that end, in that budget, we changed the level of indexation on government benefits. It had earlier been changed by the Gillard government on some, with support from the then Abbott-led opposition. But we changed the indexation for all benefits, or we sought to do this, from male total average weekly earnings to CPI. We tried to ensure that school leavers didn't go on the dole straight away. They either learned or earned. We tried to put in place a modest co-payment on otherwise bulk bill GP services. We attempted to build on earlier work to raise the aged pension age. We attempted to modestly cut back on support for universities, because why should working class people be subsidising the future incomes of people who are going to earn more than them? One of the most depressing aspects of last night's budget was the government's stated aim to ensure that within a couple of decades, 8 out of 10 Australians are university graduates. Now, given the kind of woke obsessions of contemporary university life, the last thing we need, if we are going to be a more productive economy and a more cohesive society, is more university graduates. What we need in this country right now is not more people in the talking class. We need more people right now in the working class. We need people who are plumbers, who are sparkies, who are chippies, who are mechanics, who are welders, who are builders. We need more people who can actually make things happen rather than talk about things, because let's face it, so much of what people are talking and writing about is BS. So unfortunately, last night's budget confirmed all the things that are going wrong and strengthened and reinforced all the things that are going wrong. It didn't build for the future, and that's what every budget in its own way should be doing.
What also struck me about the budget is it was a redistribution government, not a growth budget. I was having a look at some figures. If you look at the Hawke era, for example, when Hawke was PM, economic growth was 3.5% per year in real terms. This budget says the best you're going to get is in the twos. This year, in the next 4 years, 2% real growth maximum. So to me, that just shows they've given up on the idea of growth for the betterment of the nation, and instead it's a very sectional focused Labor government that's more Whitlam in focusing on its sectional interests than Hawke in focusing on the national interests.
And one of the characteristics of the budgets when Bob Hawke was Prime Minister and Paul Keating was Treasurer was that they did practice a degree of government restraint. I mean, Paul Keating was responsible for 4 budget surpluses. I think about half of his budgets involved a surplus. And it was a pro-market government, at least by Labor standards. It was a very pro-market government. And all of that emphasis on spending discipline, which Peter Walsh was important in, and all of that respect for the market has completely gone. There was not a single mention of productivity in the Treasurer's speech, and all of the practical measures were essentially green protectionism, green interventionism. There was $23 billion over the next decade for this so-called Future Made in Australia policy. And that is essentially a smaller version of the green boondoggle, which is Joe Biden's so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which is basically about throwing money at wind and solar power, throwing money at the various businesses which are involved in the production of lithium and other things that go into making batteries. Now, I'm not against developing new industries. In fact, I'm in favour of developing new industries. But if these new industries really are as prospective as the Treasurer tells us, why do they need government subsidy? Why does all of this renewable stuff need government subsidy? And given that some of these new industries are heavily backed by billionaires such as Twiggy Forrest, why can't the billionaires put up their own billions rather than expect the taxpayer to contribute further billions to their existing billions?
No, exactly right. Look, one of the startling figures to me is, if you were to ask people, what do you think is the fastest growing item in the budget, they'd say the NDIS. Yeah. Well, the NDIS is growing at about 8% a year, but when you look at the interest payments on debt, they're growing at 12% per year. By 2028, it's going to be close to $100 million a day that we're spending as a nation servicing the debt. That's not the debt itself, that's the servicing cost of the debt. So
$35 billion a year, which is, it's probably as much as we spend on Medicare or more. And just think of what you could do with $35 billion a year. I mean, you could build, what is it the Victorian government's trying to build at the moment? Cross-city rail. I mean, you could
the suburban
build
rail loop.
The suburban rail
That'd only
loop.
get you about 2 kilometres of that loop.
Well, it would get you stage one.
Yeah.
The debt, the interest payment, the federal interest payments would get you stage one of the suburban rail loop. So now, the suburban rail loop is probably a white elephant, but nevertheless, interest repayments are dead money, and there's just this is the problem with oceans of red ink.
Yep.
It means rivers of dead money to make it all work, and it's supremely unproductive.
Yep. No, exactly right, Tony. Look, we'll have more to say about the economy and the budget in the weeks to come. Look, what I wanted to switch to now is to go from the domestic to the international. You and I have been discussing the issue of the Middle East and the conflict there. There's a vote that's taken place about the recognition of Palestine in the UN. Now, the Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, says, well, it's not to do with Palestinian statehood, but of course it is, because the UN can only properly recognise nation states. So this is, of course, a step towards recognising Palestine as a nation state. So, Tony, I wanted to get your thoughts on that vote and what it means for the conflict in the Middle East.
If I may, Dan, before we leave the budget, at least for today, the two, I suppose, new headline items last night were the $300 power bill subsidy and further rental subsidies for low income earners. Well, this is the government paying money to address problems which government policy has created. And I think there's a particular difficulty when government is causing problems and then, as it were, compounding the problems by throwing even more money at them. And if it weren't for the government's climate policy and emissions obsession, we wouldn't have power bills going through the roof, and there wouldn't be the need for this $300 subsidy. And if the government hadn't lost control of legal immigration, as well as its current difficulties on illegal immigration, we wouldn't have the same pressure on housing costs, particularly rent. So this is the government, dare I say it, shoving Band-Aids on bullet wounds, and it will be much better if instead of addressing the symptoms, the government was to tackle the fundamental problems. But I'm afraid very close to the heart of this government is this climate crusade. And the only recipe this government has for economic growth is the laziest of all ways, which is just to import more people. Now, I'm in favour of migration in principle. We are an immigrant country. Just about all of us are migrants or the descendants of migrants. The vast majority of people who come here to Australia are going to ultimately make great Australians. But this idea that we can avoid hard reform and tough decisions by simply importing people to give us artificially inflated GDP figures, it's just wrong. And it's the ultimate lazy policy making.
Well, I mean, that's why per capita growth has been going backwards. We've had four consecutive quarters.
And again, this was one of the things that struck me as so strange about the Treasurer's speech. It was relentless boosterism, which is so at odds with people's actual experience right now. Household and family budgets are under massive pressure. We've got the fact that if you've got a mortgage, your repayments have virtually doubled over the last couple of years. Everyone's power bill has gone up by about $1,000 per household. Groceries are going up 10% a year. Transport and fuel, again, 10% a year. So our real disposable incomes are close to 10% down, given all these price rises, and yet listening to the Treasurer in the budget speech, everything was fantastic. The best possible government in the best possible world, except for some of those overseas things, but there's nothing to see here domestically. Well, so many of our difficulties are either being produced at home or they're being compounded by errors that we are ourselves responsible for.
And so...
But now we can get on to that other topic.
On the international, so the Palestine situation, Tony. So this was at odds with the decision to vote in favour of that, at odds with the US, which abstained, or did the US vote?
The US opposed. Britain abstained.
Yeah. So that puts it at odds with key allies. So what does this mean for us in the international community, Tony?
My disappointment, my profound disappointment with that decision, quite apart from the fact that it breached almost 8 decades of bipartisanship, was that it looked very much like rewarding terrorism. As we've seen, since the October 7 atrocity, there's been a massive wave of protest, effectively pro-Hamas protest. Now, it's staggered and appalled me that so many people in Western countries, including Australia, have been so ready to go out onto the streets in support of a terrorist organisation that was guilty of the worst anti-Jewish atrocity since the Holocaust. And given that this was a big concession to Palestinian activism, I just think it looked like weakness in the face of terror. And then, of course, as I said, it went against 8 decades almost of bipartisan policy. It's amazing how the Labor Party has transformed since the days of Bob Hawke, not just economically, as we saw in the budget, but also in terms of attitudes to Israel. I mean, Bob Carr, former president of Labor Friends of Israel, now very hostile to Israel. The party of Bob Hawke, who once beautifully said, if the bell tolls for Israel, it tolls for all mankind. Bob Hawke's old party now, to put it at its kindest, torn on the issue of Israel, and many of the Labor Party's leading figures, partly I suspect because of the electoral politics of the Muslim community, now deeply hostile to Israel.
So just to build on that point about the changing nature of the Labor Party, so you point out one key factor there, which is the electoral politics. So in certain electorates, like in Tony Burt's electorate in Western Sydney, you've got something like 1/3 of voters there who are of an Islamic background. Similar for many others. There's several seats where it's 20 to 30%. What are some of the other factors that are driving, this change? We just talked about the economic changes. There's these cultural changes. Why is the Labor Party no longer the party of Bob Hawke and of mainstream Australians?
It's a very good question. I think in part it's because it's become a more green left party. In part it's because the long march of the left through our institutions has pushed many institutions to the left, universities, even churches, lawyers, the judiciary and so on. But I just think that anti-Semitism is wrong in principle, and anti-Zionism, given that Israel is the only liberal democracy in the Middle East, and if democracy is diminished anywhere, it is to some extent at least diminished everywhere. I just think that anti-Zionism is against Australia's national interest. And my, again, perplexity is at the way so many of these recent, well, at least some of these recent immigrant communities, particularly from the Middle East, though they are now Australian citizens, are not looking at this issue from the perspective of what's best for Australia. They appear to be looking at this issue from the perspective of what's best for Muslims. Now, we should want nothing but good for everyone, but I fail to see how continued Hamas rule in Gaza is good for the people of Gaza, regardless of their religion. And in any event, from Australia's perspective, what we should want is the success of a fellow liberal democracy, and not the success of a designated terrorist movement. And all of these protests at the moment, with their horribly anti-Semitic overtones, are effectively in favour of Hamas. And it seems that there's a mindset inside much of Islam which is very intolerant of all other faiths, the death to the infidels mindset, and seems to think that the overriding loyalty is not to your neighbour or to your country or even to your family, but to your faith. Now, I think it's right to respect one's faith, and I guess I feel bonds of solidarity and affection for my fellow Catholics, for my fellow Christians, but I certainly don't take the view my faith right or wrong. I don't even take the view my country right or wrong. I think that my country is 99 times out of 100 in the right, but if it ever was in the wrong, I would say so. And likewise, whatever you might think about the ultimate truth of Christianity or Catholicism, that doesn't mean that everything the church does or everything that is done in the name of the church is right and has to be approved by all Catholics. That I just think you only have to say the proposition to realise that it doesn't stack up.
What do you think can be done about this challenge at this point in time? Because, clearly there's a minority, but nonetheless there's a minority of people who are citizens of this country who have these beliefs. There's also the issue, I guess, with social media that when you are a migrant today, you don't really have to engage in the common culture. You sort of stay tuned to your local culture from the country that you came from. You often communicate with others in your neighbourhood in your home language. You practice your home religion. Now, all of those things should be permitted in Australia, the tolerant multicultural country we are, but clearly there's an issue when there is seemingly very little integration or assimilation that is happening, which seems to be the case now. So this is a very different challenge from even just 2 decades ago. I'm not sure we're going to get all the answers, but I'm just interested as a discussion point, what do you think can be done from maybe a policy perspective to overcome some of these barriers?
Well, the first point to make, Dan, in response is that everyone who comes to Australia comes voluntarily, and presumably that means that they come because they think their life will be better here in Australia, because they think that Australia is overall a more attractive place than their homeland. Whether they're coming because of persecution in their homeland, whether they're coming because of lack of economic opportunities in their homeland, whether they're coming because they've got family in Australia, everyone who comes for the long term to this country presumably comes because they think this country has something good and worthwhile to offer them. But once people are here, there has to be a strong expectation on them that their overriding national loyalty is to Australia, and that they will do their best to assimilate Australian values, which is respect for the rights of all, an appreciation that you cannot oppress people on the basis of religion, race, gender, etc. And that's got to be strongly reinforced at every level of our society from the government down. And when I was PM, I used to constantly talk about people joining Team Australia. And I was sometimes criticised for that. But we do need to join Team Australia. If we're going to live in Australia, we have got to join Team Australia. Otherwise, we have this concept really of Hotel Australia, where you don't really belong, you just happen to be residing here. And that's quite at odds with the mindset which has made this the great country that we are. And I think we should build on our strengths, not further develop potential weaknesses. And any idea that people are simply living in Hotel Australia as opposed to joining Team Australia would be a big step backwards.
Well, it's sort of what's called polymonoculturalism, which is many single cultures that happen to reside on the same landmass, and that's sort of what Australia feels like it could be at risk of becoming. Well, you mentioned a moment ago the sort of the universities and what's happening there, and just to maybe round out our discussion today, I think a lot of our viewers and listeners would be aware of the, I guess, protests is a charitable way of putting it, of the, pro-Palestine, which really in many ways pro-Hamas protests that are taking place on university campuses. Look, my view is you should have free speech. You should have the right to have your say, even if you are saying things that I don't agree with. But there does clearly come a point where it's becoming a form of intimidation, where it's going on and on. Clearly some students are being denied an access to a proper education. These are quasi-public institutions as well, receiving taxpayer money. The Vice-Chancellors have just been cowards, but by and large, in refusing to address, I think, this issue head on. But just interested in your perspective on university culture.
Dan, just over the last day or so, there have been indications from a number of universities that they are going to clear these pro-Hamas encampments. I think they shouldn't have been allowed to develop in the first place, and as soon as they became apparent, they should have been removed. But better late than never, and let's see whether now the universities are prepared to act upon this stated intention to clear these encampments and keep them cleared. Quite apart from the fact that it is a form of intimidation, it's a public nuisance and it's a trespass. I mean, if you or I set up a tent in someone else's front yard, that would be a trespass. And if we set up a tent on a main street or thoroughfare, that would be a public nuisance. Now, to put up tents on the front lawn of Sydney University or comparable spaces on other campuses, it is both a public nuisance and a trespass. It goes way beyond a legitimate right to protest and to free speech, and it becomes, as we've been saying, a form of intimidation. So, of course, these must be cleared. And again, there hasn't been sufficient leadership from the top here. It is dismaying that every time ministers in the government, and until recently chancellors and vice-chancellors, have mentioned anti-Semitism, they've felt the need to bracket it with Islamophobia. Now, anti-Semitism is rampant, Islamophobia is almost non-existent, and the need to bracket the two together is displaying the kind of ostentatious even-handedness which ultimately amounts to cowardice. And we need more courage, we need more conviction all round.
Absolutely, Tony. Well, on that note, we'll end it there. So thank you very much for the generosity of your time and insights, and we'll catch up again in about a fortnight.
We will indeed, Dan.
This is a production of the Centre for the Australian Way of Life at the Institute of Public Affairs. To find out more, visit australia.ipa.org.au.